Welcome, everybody, to Soccer 101. My name is Taylor Rockwell, and this week, in honor of Eric Ten Hag in Germany, Nuno Espirito Santo in the Premier League, and Bruno Lage in Benfica, we're talking managerial sackings, managerial departures, managerial fires, Graham Ruthven. Oh, boy, it's a whole new person. Graham, are you excited to talk about people losing their jobs? It's a weird one.
I note that you've called me into the training ground early today for a meeting, Taylor, before all the players get here. I presume it's good news and that I still have a job. Or that I've been replaced by Grahaming Ruthven?
Yeah, that's the issue. It's who's the other Scottish Graham who writes about soccer?
Graham Hunter is
Yes,
the
you've been
Spanish...
replaced by Graham Hunter, sorry.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
I mean, that's fair.
Never.
That's fair.
Never would I replace you, Mr. Ruthven. But we are going to talk sackings. Kind of inspired by some of the news, mostly just a topic that comes up a lot, we talk about a lot, or we talk around a lot, but I think we don't ever really dive into fully how it works, why it happens, some crazy moments in the history of managers being fired. Graham, I'm excited to talk this one today.
Yeah, I mean, it's just something that we accept as part of soccer, right? But if you broaden it out to what a sacking or a firing is in the real world, thankfully, I have never been sacked from a job in my life, and hopefully that won't happen. Although maybe Taylor's got some bad news for me after this episode.
We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, but I would imagine to be fired or sacked from a job would be traumatic and a bad thing, and we just kind of accept it as that manager has been sacked. So it's one of these things, along with transfers, buying people for a job is, when you broaden it out to the real world, is weird, and I think sackings fits that category.
Agreed. It must be really hard to be a manager who is fired, because you're already sort of constantly criticized and discussed without you really having to weigh in, but your every move is analyzed. Why did they say this? Why did they shake that hand? Why did they break that television monitor? And then it kind of gets dissected and broken down, and eventually you're going to get mocked, and fingers are going to be pointed at little moments that might not have mattered, but to other people they did, and you don't really have an outlet for coming out and saying okay, here's what happened, here's why it didn't go well, because sometimes you can't, sometimes people don't really care. But it does feel like a very public thing that happens that is very embarrassing, but also happens all the time. So maybe it isn't that embarrassing in the end.
Yeah, I think it is embarrassing in some cases. I've got a perfect example of that. So Russell Martin, as we're recording at Rangers, it looks like he's on the brink of the sack. And he mentioned once in a press conference, just because these guys have to fill time, right? They have to talk to the media. He mentioned that the criticism has been so bad and the press coverage has been so bad that he called his mum just to let her know that she was fine, that he was fine, she was fuming. She's a big Rangers fan. Why are you continuing to play this back three, Russell? No, but it was just an off-the-cuff human moment where he was I called my mum just to let her know that I was okay. And now, the criticism or the mocking of that has been absolutely brutal, where he's being called Mummy's boy Martin, and chants of, are you going to call your mum Russell Martin? And it's just moments like that. I think, I'm quite glad I'm not a football manager.
So what should have been a human universal moment of calling your mom to feel supported and loved is turned around as weakness.
Yeah.
let's set his car on fire.
Welcome to Scotland.
The only way to deal with this. Oh boy, I would do well there. I think the other interesting thing when it comes to managers being sacked and then the discussion around it is that I do think we exist in a world in which it happens far more often than it used to, certainly in the 60s and 70s, but even compared to the 90s, I think it is a much more common occurrence. And so I think when it becomes more frequent, it just becomes a thing that happens more often that we then are going to talk about with less severity. And I feel like it used to be when a manager was sacked, there was a time in which that was huge news and stop the presses moments. And now it feels don't stop the presses because someone else is going to be sacked in 5 minutes, and we got to cover that one too.
Yeah, so I found a study that looked at the big 5 European leagues over the last 8 years up until 2024.
It wouldn't be by CIES, would it?
I think we may have read the same same report. Did you read this one?
Yeah,
so it said the average managerial tenure is between 35 and 69 games, which if you place it in the middle of those two ranges as two extremes is about a season. That really puts into perspective how little time managers get to put across their ideas and get results. I found another Sky Sports study that says November is the most dangerous month for Premier League managers. So if you're a struggling manager and it's getting up to Halloween, then don't answer your phone.
Did you see the average was on the low end 35 games?
Yes.
So the average manager doesn't last the length of a Premier League season.
That's right.
That is crazy.
That is insane. And I found another article by the LMA, which is the union for managers in English football. I think it stands for the League Managers Association. They say the average tenure of a manager in the top 4 divisions in English football has halved in the last decade. Which naturally means that not obviously a lot of those managers maybe just get let go at the end of their contract at the end of a season. But a lot of them are getting sacked as well, and they're getting sacked more often. And the Athletic says that the average time of length of time in charge has fallen from nearly 4 years in 2012 to just 2 years now. And if you look at the Premier League and how many changes of manager, and you can find this, there's a helpful chart on Transfer Market that shows you the number of managerial changes in a Premier League season. It's not exactly a linear increase. Some seasons are more than others. It's not like a chart that goes constantly up. But broadly speaking, it's definitely gone up over the last 10 to 15 to 20 years. The 23-24 season had 32 changes of manager, which I remember that season. Do you remember that season? That was the Leeds season. Remember they sacked Jesse Marsh, then they have Javi Garcia, then Big Sam comes in, and it felt like everyone was up to it that season. 32 changes of manager for 20 teams in the Premier League that one season. The 17-18 season had 20. There hasn't been a season in the Premier League in the single figures for managerial changes for 20 years, since 2005. And if you go back to the sort of 90s and the early 2000s, it was quite common to have a single figure season. So yes, all signs point to managers being sacked more often these days than in the past.
And if we're trying to boil down the reasons for that, I feel like there are 2 basic ones. The first is probably not the biggest, but it's the one I'm going with first. It's media. And it's basically how fast news travels, how easy it is to follow a team, to cover a team. You can, I've never been to Bournemouth, but you can find a bunch of different sites that discuss Bournemouth in detail, and you can learn all about the issues, and you can then voice your own concerns about them, even if I've never been there. And that extends to pretty much every single club. I feel like the way clubs are discussed, because it's oftentimes online, tends to be more critical, tends to be more negative, I feel like. But then coverage is trying to get clicks. I think a negative story drama is always going to sell more, and so I think there's more of a vested interest in kind of getting into why there's crisis. Is this club in crisis? Is this going wrong? Is this a manager? Is he getting it right? All those things. I think just the conversation is so much more immediate and so much more extreme that it leads to immediate extreme decisions, aka sacking. And then I think the other bigger one, which kind of relates to media, is money, essentially. Yeah. It's just there's more money in the game, and so you have more to lose if things go poorly, if you don't qualify for the Champions League, whatever it might be. But I think also the influx of people who want to run clubs like businesses means that if you are, a part of the machine that isn't functioning, they're going to get rid of you theoretically to find a part that does fit better. And so I think as we've had clubs kind of move towards more of a business model versus a community organization or whatever they might have been in the past, I think it means those decisions happen much faster, much more swiftly, and oftentimes I think much more brutally, basically.
Yeah, the financial reward for a lot of these clubs has never been greater, and so that just adds to the levels of desperation. I also think it's somewhat linked to, and stick with me on this one, it's somewhat linked to the Bosman ruling, I think, as well, because previously it was easier for clubs to change large portions of their team. So if you have an underperforming team, Bosman ruling meant that you could get rid of players more easily. You also didn't have transfer windows back in the day, not even that long ago. The transfer window is a fairly new thing. I think when Manchester United were signing players like Andy Cole or whatever and guys like that in the 90s, they just signed them in March or whenever they wanted them, and so it was easier to make those changes. Now, of course, you have players have more power in terms of where they go, in terms of their career paths, and as I say, you've got these transfer windows now. So if you're an underperforming club, what's the easy and lazy thing to do? Is to change the manager and hope for the best, and so I think that's a factor as well.
So let's jump to that then. The reasons why a manager might be sacked. And I think it's results first and foremost. Almost always results are going to be the thing. If you don't win your first 4 games, that's going to be a bad look. I think there are other factors in there. If you don't win your first 8 games, that's going to be an even worse look. I think if it's a bad run of form, clubs are going to start to kind of look at you. Decision makers are going to start evaluating, just because you go 0-4 doesn't mean that you're immediately going to be sacked, but I think it means the eyes are on you, the scrutiny is that much greater, and ultimately results are going to be the biggest determining factor in whether or not a manager sticks around.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest reason why a manager would be sacked. I think there's kind of two on-field reasons, and they're kind of linked, but also like manner of performances as well. And there's some rare cases where a manager's results have actually been okay, but a club has maybe been with them for a number of seasons and they just want to shake the snow globe and see what happens. I think of West Ham recently, who actually didn't sack David Moyes. He got to the end of his contract, but effectively he was sacked. He would have stayed if they wanted him. And that's worked out perfectly for them since they got rid of David Moyes.
Real Madrid have two examples of this, I would say. Fabio Capello sacked after winning the title because the football wasn't pretty enough. And similarly, Real Madrid sacking Vicente Del Bosque is maybe even a worse one because in 4 seasons he wins 2 European Cups, 2 league titles, a European Super Cup, a Club World Cup, and then is sacked the day after winning that second league title. Again, I think part of it is like the style of play, but also part of it was his personality and a feeling that he was like too calm, apparently, for Madrid, and they wanted more fight out of a manager. And that, I think, gets to, if it's not results, it can be a disconnect in philosophy or approach. So if you have a manager who wants to play ultra defensively for a club that historically is very attacking, that might go the wrong way. You can have a manager who says something like David Moyes managing Manchester United. We aspire to play like our crosstown rivals. And I think that can start to be like, you don't really have the mentality, disposition, whatever it might be for the club that we wish to be. So out you go. So I think like if it's not results, I think a difference in philosophy or approach is going to be a prominent factor in a sacking.
Yeah, just going back to Real Madrid, we've seen that fairly recently with going from Ancelotti to Xabi Alonso. I know Real Madrid's last season wasn't outstanding, still finished second in La Liga and made a decent run in the Champions League, but they want to modernise under Xabi Alonso. They want to be a little bit higher up the pitch and be possession orientated. So that was certainly a big factor in Ancelotti leaving Real Madrid last season. So yeah, there are some on-field things there that I think you've outlined very well there, Taylor. Some off-field things as well. One of those things might be the breakdown of the relationship between the owner and the manager, or in the modern game, increasingly the sporting director and the manager. And I would point to the recent sacking of Nuno by Nottingham Forest, which actually, by all accounts, seems to have been put more on the relationship between Nuno and Edu, the sporting director, than Marinakis. I mean, Marinakis has kind of gone along with it as the owner and got his pal in, Big Ange. But yes, that was certainly a breakdown in the relationship between those decision makers. Could also be that a manager has, inverted commas, lost the dressing room, which is always one of my favourite, soccer cliches.
I think it was Ian Holloway when he was at Blackpool was asked about that, and he responded like, "No, it's down the hallway." Like taking it very literally as to where the dressing room was.
Very Ian Holloway. I think it's overused, but it does happen occasionally. Where basically a manager no longer has the backing of their own players, and it seems like that was a factor in Erik ten Hag leaving Leverkusen. So there's a few factors. He also fell out with the sporting director there, Rolf.
Everyone? It seems like everyone, like the tea lady, the boot man, everybody was not enjoying Erik ten Hag. Like a prime example of that, the falling out thing, would be in my mind Villas-Boas when he's at Chelsea, and like results aren't great. I don't think Abramovich at the time was like fully as enamored of him as he was when he brought him in, but it's the old guard of Terry, Lampard, and I think Drogba. I think there's a couple others in there, but they were sort of like, this is not the way we want to play. He's trying to phase us out. He's trying to kind of change the DNA of Chelsea. Feels like a lot of it was he's trying to phase us out, us like the key old guard, and so a lot of like murmurings of discontent became open discontent, became we can't replace the 11 players, but we can replace the manager, and so that's what they did. So when you start to lose the squad, when you start to have players downing tools, the Manchester United way, if you will, then I think it spells doom for the manager.
Yeah, it definitely happens. As I say, Ten Hag, it seems to have been a factor for him. The reason I say it's overused is I think a lot of the time, particularly in modern media and modern soccer, clubs will brief after a manager has been sacked, and that is like their go-to, which is like the players didn't want to play for him anymore, he was unpopular in the dressing room. I'm just always a little bit sceptical of that when it's coming from the club after that they've made that decision. But as I say, it does happen. Another thing that does happen, and this is less common, but it might be that the manager has breached the club's code of conduct in some way. So and that can take you in a number of different directions. So it could be something as fairly innocuous as Max Allegri being sacked by Juventus, which they said was for a conduct issue. He was sent off after a match, apparently abused a referee. It was also true that Juventus had a terrible season and it was the last game of the season, and so he was going to leave anyway. But anyway, that was the reason given by Juve. Another example, maybe the most infamous example of this, was Big Sam, who was sacked after just one game as England manager after a newspaper sting where he was caught giving advice on how to get around rules on third-party ownership. He technically didn't do anything like illegal. That's why he's been able to work in football to this day. But the FA decided that it was against their code of conduct as a national association, and he was sacked. So that's another way that a manager can lose their job.
Yeah. Two more for you. 1977, Manchester United manager Tommy Docherty was sacked after it was revealed he had an affair with Mary Brown, the wife of club physio Laurie Brown. He was fired, though he did, I believe, end up marrying Mary Brown, who I'm guessing did not keep the last name Brown after that one. But yeah, so you can have sort of those types of conflicts of issues, and then another one would be Delio Rossi, sacked by Fiorentina in 2012 for trying to punch his own player.
Yeah.
And I think that can be a combination of maybe losing the dressing room when you're taking a swing at one of your players, but also I think it was when the player, I think it was Adam Liaich, formerly of Manchester United, they're getting a lot of billing here, sarcastically applauded the manager for subbing him off, and it felt like that was kind of things boiling over at the club having to make a move because things had become so toxic. But you can have those type of interactions, altercations that factor into the decision too.
Yeah, there's a couple other sort of weird and wonderful ones that I've got here on my list. So my favourite was Ife Onyuora, who was fired. Did you see this, Taylor? Fired as Ethiopia manager because he complained to the media that he had to clear cows from the training pitch before a training session. And the federation didn't like that and fired him for bringing the national sport into disrepute. So
yeah, I love that that wasn't exaggerated and they didn't address it. It was just like, you don't talk about it. Don't make us look bad. I mean, yeah, sure, you had to clear cows. Like, who doesn't?
Don't make us look bad.
Don't say it.
Yeah, but there were cows on the training pitch. Yeah, but we don't have to tell people that.
Yeah, that was a little ridiculous.
I hadn't heard of that one before I did my research. One that I was familiar with, and I'm always amazed that this is sort of left out of the Leicester City story. But the Leicester City title-winning story starts with Nigel Pearson getting sacked because his son, who also worked for the club, was involved in a racist sex tape during Leicester's pre-season tour of Thailand. And it was reported that Pearson's sacking as manager was linked to that. In comes Claudio Ranieri, and the rest is history. But that piece of history starts off with like an orgy scandal on a pre-season tour. So, yeah, that bit's left out.
That'll do it. That's a bit of a scandal. One other category, I'm not sure where it would fit in, but I guess we could talk about maybe Julian Lopetegui when he is sacked by Spain because he's going to take the Real Madrid gig, right? So there can be instances in which the manager's head has been turned, or it comes out that they are already looking at another gig or whatever it might be, and maybe the club who presently employs them doesn't love that. So you can also have those kind of strange wrinkles in a managerial process. But I feel like we've kind of gone through a lot of the main reasons why a coach would be sacked. Any other ones, Graham?
No, I'm just in my own head reflecting on how wild the Lopetegui one was, which I actually am not a fan of Lopetegui as a manager at all, so maybe Spain dodged the bullet, but to sack him, what was it, on the eve of a World Cup?
Insane.
When they just had to give it to Fernando Hierro as assistant, and they had a poor tournament, largely because, all their plans went out the window. Just
he was
4
already
years.
in Russia, right? Lopetegui?
He must have been, yeah. They had to be. Yeah, it was the eve of the World Cup, so they had to have been there for a training camp and everything, and just what an incredibly impulsive decision. Makes more sense when you realise the man that made that decision was Rubiales.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it does.
Wild.
Not a good way. So we've talked about the reasons they might be sacked. Let's talk about how it tends to go down. Graham joked about it in the beginning, that Monday morning, hey, come on in early after we lost yet again this weekend. It does seem to be generally it is the case that it is a private face-to-face meeting. It might be the owner. More commonly, I think it's the sporting director, or it might be a couple different people. Sometimes that's to soften the blow. I think sometimes that's maybe strength in numbers. Sometimes it might be because there are myriad reasons why the sacking is going down. Either way, it tends to be face-to-face, ideally in a private space. Sometimes that is not the case, but generally speaking, I think that's the way clubs hope that it can go down.
Yeah, and most of the time a manager will know that the writing is on the wall, right?
Yeah.
They can read the tea leaves and the media and the newspapers, and there might have been something leaked to the media about how their position is under threat. So, and also they'll very likely have gone through this process before as a manager in this in this industry. So they'll know it's coming. And one of the things that I'm not in the know, I don't have inside information, but over the years learning from and hearing from people who do have that information, one of the things that I've learned is a lot of the time the discussion over when to sack a manager will start earlier than people realise. So there will be for example, we're recording this, Ruben Amorim's under pressure from Manchester United right now, but it feels maybe like the beginning of the end rather than he's going to be sacked imminently. I can almost guarantee that Jason Wilcox and Jim Ratcliffe have had an informal discussion about, well, what do we do if we have to sack this guy? And that could look like, it won't be like a boardroom meeting or anything formal. It's usually the case of like the sporting director going round to the owner's house for a cup of tea or a coffee or whatever, and they'll discuss it. And that's kind of how the ball starts rolling. And it's not until really late in the day that they'll formalise it. So it might not be until they've made the decision that it's actually like put on the agenda. Because you can imagine if you're a manager, you can't exactly have the manager's position being on like a board meeting's agenda if they aren't going to then fire you, like, because that then sows seeds of uncertainty. So when it accelerates at the end of that process, it tends to happen very quickly. And as you say, Taylor, when it's done in an organised and sort of respectful way, it usually looks like a manager being called to the training ground early, usually before players get there, and they'll be informed in a meeting there, and then they'll leave before the players arrive, so they avoid that awkwardness, and maybe the media as well. It can also happen after a game, which always feels like the most impulsive option, where like the owner or the sporting director is so angry at what they've just watched that they fire the manager on the spot. And I remember that happened to Steven Gerrard at Aston Villa after a game at Fulham in London.
Yeah.
And the famous or infamous story is that he wasn't allowed to go back on the team bus, and so he had to find his own way back to
Run
to
home,
Birmingham.
Stevie.
Yeah, it's only like 150 miles or something. And then there's also countless examples of managers being informed by email or text that they've been fired. Also, a few examples of managers who have read in the media that they've been fired before they've actually been told by their club.
There's some good strange ones. We'll get to those. I think Martin Jol was fired during a game, so that like it became widely reported that his successor had already been like agreed upon as the game was happening. So he goes in talking about the game. He comes out talking about what his next gig will be. And I think with that in mind, it seems like to your point, the decision to sack a manager is like an evolving process that usually happens well ahead of time, or like well ahead of when it actually occurs. And I think that can just be general conversations about like, hey, are you liking the way training's going? Are you liking the results? Are you liking the philosophy? Are we still aligned? Hey, he's complaining a lot of the media about signings. I think those conversations happen more and more, and they start to kind of like maybe get the ball rolling. And I think around that same time is when you will have clubs also start to look around at like who might be available if and when. Yeah. And so if there is a huge manager suddenly available, then I think the sacking talks are going to be expedited versus like there's no one who we can really bring in that's going to like give us an immediate bounce or give us an immediate boost in terms of fan reactions, so we're going to hold off. But I think it is a very slow and consistent process that then kicks into high gear pretty quickly. Before we get to like strange examples of sackings, Graham, one question for you, because you can't really have that like the open boardroom conversation about it. Why is the vote of confidence in the manager such a dreaded thing? Like that's the joke, right? That like Ruben Amorim has received the backing of the Manchester United board. Like he is the way forward, and I think everybody tends to greet that as like, writing's on the wall.
Yeah. If I had to break that down, I think it's because it's an acknowledgement, it's a talking point, right? That it's like a possibility that the manager might
We have
sacked.
To acknowledge that it could be a possibility he's fired.
Which means they're talking about it. They've had a discussion about it, and then it feels like things are going to progress from there. So I think that's why it's seen in that way.
So two more like kind of famous examples, I would say, of managers finding out in unusual ways. There is Bobby Robson finding out he'd been sacked by Fulham when he read it on the front page of, I think, a newspaper outside of a train station. That would be kind of brutal, but maybe also a sign of a bygone era. Gus Poyet as well,
Yeah, that's
sacked
the
by
one,
Brighton
man.
while doing live commentary for a Confederations Cup game. That feels like a bummer.
I remember that. I think I watched that
Really?
live. Yeah. 'Cause I mean, Confederations Cup. I would have watched that. And it's Mark Chapman, the host, who clearly they didn't plan on talking to Gus Poyet about his job at Brighton. But when he gets sacked on air, you kind of have to. And it was very awkward indeed. But yeah, that's the one that sticks in the mind for me.
Do you want to manage Nigeria now, Gus? I hear you've got some time. That would be some awkward commentary. So you do. Wait, do you have more of the random ones, the strange ones?
I don't. I had Gus Poyet and Gerrard as well in terms of
Gerrard
is being notified.
Gerrard's the biggest one, I think, of just sort of like because I'm sure it didn't happen this way. I'm sure he was pulled into like some small room in the stadium and it was discussed. It does feel like you can board the bus. You can board the bus. Not so fast, Stevie. And so when you have those conversations, when you do have the kind of private version of the sacking conversation, I feel like on rare occasions, I think there is like a conversation with HR that immediately follows about like what the process is going to look like. I think more often than not, there's probably media and PR people there to make sure that the message is controlled, to make sure that the sacked manager knows what they are maybe not allowed to say if they want to stay within terms of their contract. But I think largely that's where you have agents then getting involved, getting a phone call. Maybe that's a separate conversation that follows immediately after about terms of the contract as it exists, what the payout is going to be like, what the settlement will be, how all of those deals will work out. And sometimes that's kind of pretty cut and dry, already agreed upon. We don't need to negotiate. Sometimes things get awkward and prolonged, and that's where, Graham, we get the famed gardening leave coming in and things like it. Explain gardening leave, if you would.
Yeah, so this is something I believe is related to UK employment law, when basically an employer tells an employee to stay away from the workplace during a notice period, even though they are technically still employed, and so they'll still be on full pay.
What is a notice period for our American ears?
Where you have, like, they're no longer doing the job, and there's like an expiry date of when they will leave, but for that period they are still technically employed by the club, and they'll be on full pay, and basically they're still like employed on the same terms of their contract. They're just not allowed in the building, right? And it's not purely a football thing, actually. I remember when I worked at STV, the head of the channel was poached by the BBC when I was working there, and I remember this day vividly. As soon as he told STV that he was leaving and he was going to the BBC, he got like taken out of the building by security. And was placed on gardening leave, basically because STV were like, well, that's a rival, and we can't have him working here and taking any more secrets. Not that STV had many secrets over to the BBC. So it's similar with football clubs. And you're right, Taylor. It's normally linked to, maybe it's happened so quickly, or maybe there's a disagreement over the severance package or how things will end there, and they haven't actually sorted things out, but the club knows they want this guy out and they want someone else in, and so they'll place them on gardening leave. They don't always use that term. I mean, Chelsea did it for a number of managers. There was a period where I think they were paying 3 managers full wages. I remember they went through that period where it was Tuchel, then it was Potter, and then was there one more? Lampard maybe was placed on gardening leave as well. But basically there was a period where they were paying multiple managers, and they'd essentially just placed them on there.
Around London.
Yeah, exactly. But it's kind of it's sort of used as a tongue in cheek. I think the term comes from like a tongue in cheek reference of like, you've got so much time on your hands now. What are you going to be doing? Oh, I'm going to be working on my garden. Is kind of where it comes from, I think.
Graham, you personally, if you are brought in to manage Rangers, right? And first season goes well, but then second season maybe will start to come off. You feel like the writing's on the wall. Are you a start to clean out the office ahead of time person, or are you you're going to have to drag me out of here, I'm dug in like a tick? Like, what's going to be your approach?
I mean, I will happily take the payoff from Rangers and never step foot in that club again. But if we're talking about like another large club in the UK, I think you'd have to drag me out. I'm gonna bleed the club dry for everything they've got.
I always wonder about that, because something about carrying. I've also never been fired, so like the idea of like carrying out the sad box of possessions doesn't really appeal on that day. I feel like you want all of that dealt with either by other people, and I do think there are staff that will clean out the office and ship everything to you, so you can just be on your way. But I think of like There was that famous picture of David Moyes when he was managing Manchester United, and it's him at a desk with like his hand on the mouse pad smiling, and just that office looks very barren at that point. It looks like, we've given you an office, but maybe don't bring in any like personal flair for the first few months, and we'll see how this goes.
See, the thing is, these people at the elite level anyway, these people are getting paid so much, and they've got people who can help them from the club. I kind of wonder if they just go, I'll get new possessions. Like, I don't need to clear them out.
There's just a lost and found at Chelsea of like items disregarded by managers. It's just like framed
bag of lemons.
Of,
that's Pochettino's.
Yeah. Oh. Avram Grant's framed photo of his grandchildren. That's still here? Oh, boy. Roberto Di Matteo's Champions League winner medal is still in here. Wow. Didn't know that one was hanging out. So, Graham, like, what do you feel then about, like, sackings in general? Because it's a very, like, big topic, and I think the answer is probably, like, sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. Yeah. Sometimes it's useful. Sometimes it's overly used. I think I still like cling a bit to the idea of the manager who is kind of like part of the institution, and that is definitely the Manchester United Alex Ferguson of it all. But there is something to the allure of like the manager who's been there long enough to understand the intricacies of the position, understand the community and the club and the operators therein, and to just kind of be a person who can help weather a storm when there is a bad season. I think American sports, because of the parity and the salary caps and the like, I do still think there is more acceptance of like, it's a rebuilding year. We're not going to fire our legendary coach because it's a rough year. We're going to stick with them. We're going to rebuild them then. But if it's like 2 or 3 seasons, and I'm painting with a broad brush because there are certainly franchises that aren't like that. But I do think sometimes Premier League clubs in particular pull that trigger way too early out of a sense of like panic and frustration more so than informed observation.
Yeah, and that's a shame. I mean, it's a good thing for us as media members who need new things to talk about every week. But in general, I think it paints an image of a sport that is increasingly impatient and wasteful as well. That's the biggest thing. There's so much waste with all the payouts and, you know, I mentioned as we record, Manchester United could sack Amrin before the end of the year. I mean, they've just completely remoulded their squad and got rid of like wide attackers and brought in new players. And then if someone else comes in, they'll have to rebuild again. They've obviously done that multiple times, and we see that across the elite level in European football. And I think it's certainly true that there aren't many figures who are embedded as part of the furniture with clubs anymore. I mean, Pep is maybe the closest that there is right now at Manchester City. He's coming up for like 10 years at Manchester City, and even he's talked about like maybe at the end of his contract in 2 years he will leave. Klopp departed, over a year ago. I mean, who are the Fergusons and the Wengers? Who are those figures now in football? I guess it's Diego Simeone is maybe the only one, and him and Pep, what you would say. But other than that, there's really not many of them at all.
It's a strange situation, I think, because with those clubs that did have that manager in place, that manager becomes sort of the decision maker almost, or they are the most important decision maker, at least like publicly facing. And so they kind of have more authority. I think what has happened more often presently is that you have the clubs themselves that have new board members and new ways of operating and changes to ownership or what have you. And it feels like you then get factions within the club, and you don't have everybody pulling in the same direction with one person sort of overseeing it. You have, to stick with Manchester United because they are the chaos club at present, you have factions that wanted Ten Hag in, you have factions that want Ten Hag out, and so then you're going to have them sort of pointing to like, well, that performance was bad, and even though they won, this was still bad, and so you're going to get those warring factions that eventually one will win, and you get rid of Ten Hag. But now their replacement manager, if he's not succeeding, that other side has a point to prove. And I think it speaks to, again, more of a like competitive succession-esque environment in clubs that maybe didn't exist there previously.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about when you mentioned American sports and the parity there. I mean, I've got a very surface level grasp of traditional American sports, but Belichick being at the Patriots for so long, and Andy Reid as the Kansas City Chief coach, right? That hasn't been fired in the time since I watched last year's Super Bowl. And even like in MLS, like Brian Schmetzer, I guess, would be the person you would put forward as one of those figures. But yeah, they feel like a rarity in soccer, which is a shame, because I don't think the game is necessarily better for having all this managerial uncertainty. Like, yeah, there's more to talk about, but do you feel like the standard is better for changing managers every 35 games or something like that? I probably don't.
I'd say no. And I think about two examples on the American side. Like Greg Popovich with the San Antonio Spurs. He recently retired, but he was there for almost 30 years, I think, and they did not win the NBA championship 30 times in that timeline. But I think he's a legendary coach. He's legendary with like getting the best out of his teams, but also developing players. I think he's also pretty outspoken and has a lot of popularity in the city. And so you stick with him, like even if it's a rebuilding season, even if things aren't going well, because you kind of have faith in him as a leader and as an organizational like figure. And on the NFL side, I feel like Mike Tomlin in Pittsburgh is another example of that. I think he's only like their third head coach since like 1960 or something ridiculous. Like the Steelers do not fire their coach, but you then have a coach that you know is going to be there. You kind of, if the season is great, good, he's going to stick around. If the season is poor, well, we're going to back him to rebuild. And I think that can lead to malaise and feelings of frustration if it's just sort of inactivity and a feeling that no one is being held accountable. But if it is patience and like calm in the face of that storm, I think there's a lot of strength to that. So as always, I think it's something in the middle of like sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. But I think overall, I would urge clubs to either be more cautious with that decision, as we were talking about before we started recording with Benfica. When they first bring in Jose Mourinho, he wants a contract extension. They say no, and then he goes on to win the Champions League with Porto. They probably regret that one. I don't think Bayer Leverkusen are going to regret firing Erik ten Hag. Yeah. And by all accounts, they wanted to do it before the season even began. And so I think if you fully get that, like, this is not the right fit philosophically, we do not have the right personalities meshing, everybody seems to be out on him, maybe we just got to do it. And I get why they wouldn't want to do that because it's bad optics. But there are times when I think you do have to be aggressive. I just think there are more times that maybe a bit more reason and calm wouldn't be the worst idea.
Yeah, it has to be determined on a case-by-case basis. I mean, I think of Scottish example, but Rangers firing Gio van Bronckhorst as their manager. I think in hindsight was a terrible decision. They really should have stuck out that rough period. But there are equally decisions where I think they've ripped the Band-Aid off quickly, and that was justified. So,
are you sad that Scotland sacked Steve Clarke way back when it felt like he wasn't the right manager? Oh, no, he's still there. Never mind.
Oh, Taylor, why'd you have to do that to me? Why'd you have to do that to me?
Sorry.
We're still in contention, sort of, at least mathematically, if not in spirit, for the World Cup.
Who could you... do you want Nuno? What about Nuno? Would you take Nuno now that he's been sacked?
Genuinely, well, I mean, yes, but the manager that I wanted and who I had made the argument I thought was gettable has just taken, not Steven Gerrard, has just taken a job that I am shocked that he's managed to get. Do you know who I'm talking about? Go to Germany, Bundesliga. We talked about him this week on the show. Danish coach.
Oh,
Kasper Schulman.
Yeah. I thought you were going to say Jose.
No, not Jose. Although, I mean, would it be fun?
Yes.
No, it wouldn't be fun. I don't know if it would be fun. I'm kind of convinced he will coach in Scotland one day. It'll just be one of the old firm.
I think he'd be very fun as a Scotland manager. I think you all would enjoy. You're so like starved for tournaments and competitions. I feel like you'd be okay with winning every game 1-0 and him antagonizing everybody,
totally.
But also loving your supporters. I think it would be a good vibe.
Sign me up for winning every game 1-0, but that's not what Jose Mourinho has done over the last 6 or 7 years.
Just don't get Turkish referees involved, and you'll be fine. We know that now.
There we go. We'll do that.
All right. Well, Graham, you have not been sacked. You will never be sacked. No Monday morning meetings for you other than to bring you a fresh coffee and say job well done for the weekend that was.
Oh, thanks.
Because you do watch more football than most football managers, I would say. Mr. Ruthven, thank you for talking managerial sackings, departures, firings, all that good stuff, even if it's sad stuff, on today's episode.
Thank you, Taylor Rockwell. I think I'm definitely grinding more tape than Poch, given what he's said about certain things. Maybe not more MLS tape, but tape.
I feel like that was because of the Steve Clarke shot that you had to take the shot at U.S. Soccer and Poch, and I guess it's deserved, but not appreciated.
I've also called Sergio Dest more times than Pochettino as well.
All right, well, now you're just hurting feelings. Graham Ruthven, thank you for hurting feelings. Listeners, thank you for listening to Graham Hurt My Feelings. We greatly appreciate you all listening to that and everything else, and we'll talk to you next week.